Power makes people persuasive, or so the conventional wisdom goes. But according to INSEAD marketing professor David Dubois, not everyone is convinced by it. David, thanks for joining us on INSEAD Knowledge.
Thanks, Chris.
So my first question is, when we look at powerful communicators from Winston Churchill to Richard Branson, the powerful are often seen as the most convincing. But what does your research show?
The basic question we're asking in this paper is, to what extent our inner feelings of power transform what we say in interpersonal context. So context in which we have to convince someone else about some things. And these can be interview settings, right, where you have to sell yourself. It could be a sales context where you do not have to sell yourself necessarily, you have to sell a brand or a product, but also even a word of mouth context in which people are sharing information with others. Okay? So what we find is actually that power shifts the balance as to what kind of information as a communicator you are going to share. High power is going to trigger a propensity to use competence arguments. A state of low power is going to trigger a propensity to use warmth and warm arguments. So it doesn't mean that high power in communicators are always better off, or that low power people are actually always better off. In fact, what we find is that it depends. It depends on the context where the competence is valued or warmth is valued.
So essentially both can be convincing, it just depends on who they're addressing.
Both can be convincing indeed, and there are different factors that can lead people to favor warmth or competence. So power is one. High power audiences favor competence, low power audiences favor warmth, but you can also think about different contexts. You can also think about how context varies whether people are more sensitive to competence information or warmth information. You can think about a charity, for instance, where people might be more sensitive to warmth information because they want to know why they donate and why they should care about the cause. Think in contrast, for instance, about more professional context, interview context, right? Where people, if you have to hire someone, would care more about competence than warmth.
And why are powerful people more receptive to those competence-based arguments, and perhaps less powerful audience? Why are they more interested in, warmth-based arguments?
So this effect takes place mostly because at both the communication and the reception stages, power prompts very different perspectives in people. High power prompts people to be more agentic. Low power prompts people to be more communal. So when you're agentic, what does it mean? Well, it means that you're going to value things like action orientation, like someone who's able to summarize something quickly and get to the point. When you're communal, you're going to really start looking first at someone's emotion, whether the recipient actually cares about you or not.
So what are the implications then for someone looking to be persuasive? Does it mean that the powerful should always be sort of put aside in a context where warmth is required, or can they adjust their approach?
Depending on the context and depending on who you talk to, it seems that different types of arguments are more or less impactful. This also points to a very interesting implication, which is that when a crisis occurs, let's say in social media or after an accident, the people who are addressing those who have been affected by a crisis tends to be high power. And this research suggests that it might not be the best thing to do because of the gap that exists between communicators and recipients. Right? Recipients would, in this case, expect warmth, and the communicators is going to be very high in competence. Right? Of course, you can train people to use both sets of arguments, to be warmer or more competent, but at least what you could do is try to give communicators information about who they might be speaking to, because the communicators might be able to tune their messages based on audience characteristics.
And what does this mean then for companies and the way they communicate with customers?
Well, so for companies, the big takeaway is that they should always balance competence and warmth depending on context and depending on the audience. So let's take an example. Let's say you're working for a charity. Right? So you're interested in getting donations from people, and you're particularly interested in reaching very wealthy individuals because they might make an impact. What a lot of charities do out there is focus on warmth. Right? So they put the image of someone who has been a victim of a crisis, or they emphasize the warmth aspect of a message. What this research suggests is that this is the wrong way of going, because using this strategy, you're going to be particularly effective at getting low-power donors, maybe getting a lot of small donations, but you might not be effective at tapping into these very high-power donors who might expect competence and who might expect information about the charity's competence.
Well, David, thanks for joining us on Inside Knowledge.
Thanks again, Chris.